It's time we talked about porn. Online pornography may now be a major public health issue. Have you seen the kind of content the industry has been pumping out recently? Gone are the days of a saucy pic in a magazine. What we're getting right now online is becoming increasingly explicit and violent. The worst part? That violence is making its way into the bedroom. Strangulation, whipping, deep-throating, they're all on the rise. And it's distorting our view of what good sex is like. For some people, normal sex isn't even enough anymore. Porn's ruined it for them. I'm Dr. Karan, an NHS surgeon, and in this podcast, we cut through the BS of modern health advice and tackle the biggest issues in science and medicine. Maree Crabbe is the co-founder of It's Time We Talked, an organization helping children and young people avoid porn's influence. And the stats she shares on this episode are alarming. In this episode, we touch on how children as young as 9 are being subjected to extreme, hardcore porn, how violent sexual acts in the bedroom is becoming increasingly prevalent, and how incest and teen have become a common part of porn titles, strategies to reduce or eliminate porn from your life, and much more. Enjoy. Maree, thank you so much for joining me. And where I am in the world right now, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, and I wouldn't usually be having a conversation about this topic at 9 a.m., porn. But it's wonderful to actually have this discussion because doing some reading and research about it before I spoke to you, I was pretty shocked about some of the things I found out. And it's not something which ever, landed in my horizon that this could be potentially a major public health issue, particularly for the younger generation. Now, porn, people have various misconceptions about it. How common is pornography and its use in young people particularly?
So porn is huge. Thanks for having me on, Karan, by the way. It's great to be here. Porn is huge. Porn sites account for 3 of the 15 most viewed websites in the world. So that puts them under Google and Facebook, but above many other really huge sites. They have an enormous amount of traffic to their site. So one of the largest porn sites, for example, reported that it had 42 billion visits to its site in a single calendar year. That's about 6 for every human being on the planet for one porn site. Over 115 million unique visitors every day. So it's really big. And, the development of digital and online media and technology have made it really easy to create and also to distribute. And that means that children and young people are being exposed at very high rates as well. Sometimes it's intentionally, of course, because they're seeking it out of curiosity or for arousal and masturbation, for sex education, to rebel against the rules, to keep up with their peers, to get some sense of what might be expected of them from their partners. But they're also exposed at very high rates unintentionally because porn is marketed aggressively. Games can turn into porn. They might be on their social media and someone puts a link in their messages or in their feeds. They can see it in any number of online contexts. So about half of children were not seeking porn out the first time they saw it. In the UK, a study by the Children's Commissioner recently found that 10% of children had seen pornography by the age of 9. Over a quarter, so 27%, have seen it by the age of 11, and half have seen it by the age of 13. And it's not just the occasional viewing for some young people, particularly among boys and young men. Levels of use of pornography can be really very high. They're much lower among young women. So in Australia, where I'm from, for example, a national study found that over half of 15 to 20-year-old males use pornography at least weekly, with about 1 in 6 reporting daily or more frequent consumption. For young women, those figures were about 14% reported weekly or more often, and only 1% reported daily. So for a significant number of young people, and particularly among young men, porn is a very common part of their sort of sexual socialization, if you like.
It's worrying because there's some of the statistics you mentioned, it's people, it's children, like you mentioned, 11, 12, 10 years old, stumbling onto porn, and that is often before they hit puberty. So you start to question, these are young children who are being exposed to porn, sometimes quite intense, extreme pornographic acts, who may have their sexual function, their sexual development, their sexual psychology, and their entire sexual landscape and preferences and predilection for the future influenced and shaped by pornography, which we know is not akin to the real world. And you wonder what sort of danger that will do. How does that, do you think, influence their development into adulthood? And will it have longer reaching impacts for the rest of their lives?
Yeah, I think that the concerns are heightened the younger the child, as you say, that children are seeing it often before they've hit puberty, certainly before they've had their first partnered sexual experiences. On average, young men see pornography 3 years before their first partnered sexual experience, and young women see it 2 years before theirs. So they often don't have, or usually don't have, the kind of counter reference points about what sex and relationships might really be like that they might develop through their own sort of personal sexual experiences. And the evidence, there's a growing body of evidence internationally about the impact that pornography appears to be having on children and young people. And some of that research is correlational. So it just tells us, these young people saw pornography at this age, and then they're more likely to be engaging in this behaviour. Other research is longitudinal. There's a much smaller amount of research that's longitudinal that tracks young people's, behaviours and their porn use over time. And then there's experimental research, which is with with adults, and qualitative research where we hear the stories of young people. And all of those types of research are pointing towards pornography having a role in shaping young people's sexual understandings, expectations, and experiences, and in ways that I think are quite concerning. And that becomes easier to understand when we understand what porn is like, the kind of content that children and young people are likely to be exposed to.
Now, we're hearing more and more, especially now in the online spaces, about the manosphere, this rise of potentially angry young men who are almost radicalized by extreme ideologies. They're sometimes called kind of red pill ideologies. You also then draw parallels with that and pornography potentially, where the bulk of pornography is more likely to be targeted towards that demographic, young heterosexual men. And you wonder, is that having a direct influence on male culture and male mental health?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand pornography's influence in the context of the broader cultural influences that might be shaping young people's, and particularly young men's, sort of understandings and expectations in relation to gender and gender relations, as well as sexuality. I think pornography's influence is heightened by the fact that these same kinds of messages about what it means to be a man, about the need to be dominant and controlling, about women's role being subservient and submissive, that sex is focused on or should be focused on male pleasure. Porn's influence is amplified by those kind of multiple reinforcing factors in broader society. They don't really stand alone. They end up being a kind of confluence of influences that are perpetuating those kinds of models of masculinity, if you like, and the sorts of messages that young people are likely to see when they watch pornography, the kinds of messages that they get about men, women, gender, more broadly, power, aggression, consent, pleasure, are very different from the messages that some of their parents or their grandparents might have got from the centerfold that porn used to be, the picture in the magazine. And I think it's really important that the adults in children and young people's lives have a good grasp of what contemporary pornography is like and the types of forces that influence what porn is like, because porn is a business. It's a massive global industry. And the free online porn that is the most common sort of mainstream pornography makes its money by getting and maintaining viewer attention for the purpose of advertising revenue, for data collection, and to have a longer opportunity to funnel the viewer into paid content. So mainstream, mostly targeted at male heterosexual consumer porn, often depicts aggression, and that aggression is almost always directed towards women. Something like 97% of the aggression, the largest content analysis of the most popular porn found that 97% of that aggression was directed towards women. So it might be gagging, choking, slapping, spitting, verbal abuse, all sorts of types of aggression, but it's almost always women that it's directed towards, and almost always the target of that aggression is shown to have a neutral or a pleasured or positive response. So the message to the viewer is that this is what girls and women like. They want to be choked and gagged and spanked. So gendered aggression is a really common theme. A lack of consent is also a really common theme. One study found that 35% of all of the most popular porn included some form of non-consensual behaviour. That might be that someone is overtly pushing someone away or saying no, or it might be that they're looking resistant or hesitant. The researchers also found that often the character who initially looks like they don't want to engage in something can be shown to change their mind and sometimes then enthusiastically engage in the very behaviour that they initially were looking like they didn't want to do. And that no becomes a yes story is, I think, a really problematic narrative. It says to the viewer that no doesn't mean no. It means that they haven't worked out yet that they'd really like to do that. Another study which looked at the titles of the most popular porn, and this is a study conducted by some UK researchers, I think a really important study. They took the titles of the porn videos on the home pages of the 3 most viewed websites, porn sites in the UK, every hour on the hour for 6 months, and they ended up with over 131,000 titles, which they then analysed. So it's a huge sample size of the titles of content that are what children and young people are likely to be exposed to when they first turn up on, the home pages of those sites. They found that 1 in 8 porn titles describe behaviour that constitutes sexual violence, forced sex, hidden camera, someone who's asleep or drunk or high. Incest themes were the most common form of sexual violence. Another study found incest themes in 46% of the most popular porn. Another theme is childlike themes, where they might be adult performers who are depicted as being younger with pigtails or braces on their teeth or children's clothing like pajamas or school clothes. It's depicted that there's an older adult having sex with a sort of younger a younger person who, like I say, might be an adult, but the scenario is telling us that there's something sexy about having sex with someone who is underage. Sometimes on mainstream porn sites, it is child sexual exploitation material. It is young people under 18, and it's very difficult to tell. But teen is the most common word in all porn titles, and that the titles tell us something about what the industry wants us to know about what's in that content, what they want the viewers to know. And what they tell us is that sexual violence and incest and, childlike themes are really, really common. So mainstream contemporary pornography commonly depicts these kinds of messages, along with racism. Even where these kinds of social taboos are not depicted, though, we often see gender stereotypes, so masculine dominance and female submission. We see female subservience absolutely very commonly, a lack of consent, a lack of sexual health practices, so a lack of condom use, for example, and very, very unrealistic depictions of pleasure. So young people are getting unrealistic, but not just unrealistic, deeply problematic messages about what sex is like, who it's for, and the ways that women and men relate. And I should say that in content that's not heterosexual, that is the bulk of the content, but in lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans porn, we often see a replication of these same kind of gender stereotypes where a masculine or a hyper-masculine character treats a more feminized character with the same kind of aggression and disrespect.
With the amounts of violence and essentially unfiltered material that we see on these porn websites where the societal norms are discarded and you get this sort of gendered violence and you get fetishism, incest and worse, is that because that's what the audience wants? Or is it a case of these porn websites and manufacturers trying to manipulate the landscape to be more clickbaity, to be more out there and in your face?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. So certainly that attention economy and that clickbait type of approach is part of it. That the industry is privileging content that is likely to get a response, to get maybe a shocked response, or they don't want it to be boring to the viewer. They want it to be something that's going to grasp your attention and keep your attention. So there's that. There's also that the people who spend money online on porn sites are likely to be older and more committed consumers, and they may have a tendency and inclination towards content that is, stronger, rougher, harder. And so the algorithms are feeding content that is likely to appeal to the viewer that they can make more money from. So when a 13-year-old boy, first seeks porn out or stumbles across pornography, I don't think very many of them are interested in seeing women being gagged or choked or degraded. But that is likely to be what they'll see. And the young men that we've interviewed, often talk about when they first see pornography thinking, that's weird, or that's like gross, or would she really like that? Or, they're quite kind of shocked. But then they also talk about getting acclimatized to that content, and that becoming kind of normalized. The consumption of that content is normalized amongst their peer groups, and it's kind of what you see when you go online and look for that kind of content. So the industry is shaping viewers' expectations around what they might see, and they're also responding to some kind of desire in their viewership, but perhaps the component of their viewership that are after kind of harder, rougher content. And I think we need to remember the cultural context into which this material is being fed, which is that we've got a very long history of patriarchy, of where men have been in control, and it's not even that long ago in our history in the West that women were property, like children were property, and rape was not illegal in marriage, and women's roles women didn't have the vote. Women's roles in society were very different. So porn is reflecting some of those kind of older ways of thinking about who women are, what they exist for, which is for men's pleasure and to do what men want, in a context in which there's been really strong movement towards growing, gender equality, where women's full humanity is recognised. And porn is feeding into models of masculinity and femininity that might appeal to men who are feeling like they're losing some power in their world, in their life, where they don't feel affirmed as being the boss anymore. And so are some of the, online influencers, social media influencers who we see trying to appeal to exactly those kind of models of masculinity as well.
And do you think that with porn becoming increasingly explicit and extravagant in how they display, various sexual practices, that continues to desensitize the audience towards these, sometimes quite abhorrent and violent acts? How often does that then play out into the real world, where someone's sexual preferences on the online world then have a direct impact on them being violent, choking, slapping, gagging, dehumanizing people that they then have sexual interactions with?
We definitely are seeing this acted out in the real world, increasingly so. And I think the increase in rates of sexual strangulation is a really important case study for that, for porn's influence and for the influence of the other factors that are the sort of mixture of factors shaping people's experiences. But some research recently has found, for example, that significant numbers of young adults have been choked during sex. A study from the US found that 64% of women, so nearly 2/3 of women, 29% of men, and 55% of transgender or non-binary people have been choked during sex. It's mostly men who are doing the choking, regardless of the gender of their partner, though lesbian women are more likely to choke a partner than heterosexual women. And so the US research found that almost half, 49% of men, have engaged in strangling a partner during sex, and 25%, a quarter, did so the last time they had sex. A national study in Australia recently found similar kinds of results, that over half of 18 to 35-year-olds had experienced being choked during sex, and half, 51%, had done it to someone else. The Australian research found that porn is the most common source of information about sexual strangulation. 61% of respondents said that porn is somewhere that they've learnt about this from, and it was the most common first source of information. A US study looked at young men's exposure to porn and their experiences of sexual strangulation, and found that higher levels of exposure to pornography were associated with higher levels of exposure to depictions of sexual strangulation, which was in turn predictive of a higher likelihood of engaging in sexual strangulation. And they talked about people holding the belief that strangulation is something that you can do safely, that it's pleasurable, and that it's not something that you need to seek the consent of a partner to do. And we've conducted a lot of interviews with young people about this issue. In fact, I've been interviewing young people about porn and its impacts for about 15 years. And over the years, we hear different trends, so different kinds of stories being told. And in the last few years, young person after young person from different cultural backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, geographic regions, different sexual orientations have talked about strangulation becoming a normalised sexual practice. Now, they usually don't say strangulation, they refer to it as choking, but when it's external pressure, it's strangulation, so I'm referring to it as that. But it's gone from being something that was very rarely mentioned to being something that young people are talking about being normalised. And sometimes it's done with some communication about consent, but it's also not infrequently done with no communication at all about consent, and young people spoke about it being like it's just a normal part of sex now. And often young people, and lots of adults as well, are not aware of the level of risks associated with strangulation. They might be aware that if you do it for too long, you can kill someone, but they're often not aware of the risks that can be cumulative, that can occur in the hours, days, weeks, months, and even years that follow the events. The risk of miscarriage, headaches, vision problems, stroke, all number of kinds of impacts that can occur. So it's a sexual practice we've seen a really rapid increase in recent years in different places around the world, and porn is heavily implicated in that increase in prevalence. Of course, it's also now, you can see it in mainstream television programs, on social media, you'll see people promoting it as something that you can do safely, and there are no guardrails on social media to prevent them from giving that false information. We've interviewed forensic medical examiners with expertise in strangulation who've all said in no uncertain terms that it's not a practice that you can do safely, in part because of the unpredictability and the variation between people.
Do you think that we're seeing a rise in sexual dysfunction directly as a result of porn? For example, we already discussed how porn can influence someone's sexual landscape and expectations. So when someone watches porn, which is not a mirror of real life, they come to expect certain things which give them a degree of arousal and pleasure. And so when they actually have sex in the real world or some sort of sexual interaction, they're almost let down because it doesn't match what they used to see. And then, almost from a neurological point of view, it's not, giving that same dopamine reward cycle as porn gave them, that virtual interaction gave them, which was an easier sort of hit of pleasure. And then in the real world, that discord between what they saw and what they're experiencing is leading to, premature ejaculation, sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction, and all sorts.
Yeah, there's certainly a growing kind of movement online of young men in particular, in their 20s and 30s, describing the impact of pornography on them and their sexuality and their sexual performance. But I think in terms of other kinds of consequences, we see porn use is associated with self-objectification and objectification of a partner. So for men or boys to be transferring that objectification of the women in porn onto their female sexual partners, for example, it's associated with a greater likelihood of engaging in risky sexual behaviours, so strangulation, but also unprotected sex or sex where there's not been negotiation around contraceptives or protection from STIs, with coercion, so with coercive sexual behaviours, pressure to engage in something that they've seen in pornography, with aggressive attitudes and behaviours towards women in particular, and that influence is greater when the viewer feels that their consumption of pornography is anonymous. So, which of course is really common and easy in online pornography. It generally is anonymous, and most children and young people, when they see pornography, they see it alone and at home. That's the most common context. So there are a whole range, I think, of consequences or of associations and impacts. And generally, what we hear and what we see in the research more broadly is that young people are reenacting things they've seen in porn. And when we hear what the porn script is like, what that often looks like is men aggressively or boys aggressively engaging in anal sex, ejaculation on faces and bodies, strangulation, what the industry refers to as deep throating, which is fellatio with the penis thrust into the throat, which is how there is often gagging in the statistics around what's in pornography. And when we interview young women, they talk often about their partners initiating these, what we might call signature sex acts from porn. And women talk often about really struggling with how to respond, wanting to please their partners, wanting to be generous and accommodating in their sexuality, wanting the validation that they get from engaging in, what's expected of them, but often not wanting or liking what they've seen in pornography. We also hear, and, when in my interviews with medical practitioners with expertise around sexual health, so doctors with sexual medicine expertise and pelvic floor physiotherapists, about an increase in painful sexual conditions among young women, and also an increase in fecal incontinence because of the aggressive anal sex that they're having. So they're talking about shifts. Sexual violence services are talking about shifts. Harmful sexual behaviours treatment services are talking about shifts. And porn is looking like the key factor here in these shifts.
Now, obviously, what we've discussed so far has been more shining the light on bad examples of porn and how it affects humans, not only psychologically, but physically as well, from degrading sexual acts to violence to unsafe hygiene practices and safe sex practices, which are thrown out the window. Are there any examples of good pornography which almost highlights what should be done? Or if there's not, is there a role for pornography, which we already know is basically becoming the default sexuality educator for the masses, and that's not going to go away overnight. So is there a role now for good examples of porn, which does highlight, gender equitable sex practices, safe sex, and kind of just more shines a light on things from a anatomical, physiological, and psychological point of view, which could be almost helpful in some instances?
Yeah, look, I want to say that I think that in terms of degrading sexual practices, I want to acknowledge that people have very diverse tastes around sexuality, and that diversity is good. In general, it's a good part of being a human, that people like different things, have different tastes and expressions and experiences. So it's not the fact that there is diversity that's the problem. In fact, I think it's in some ways it's the opposite with porn, is this repeated script of deliberate hostility and degradation that's targeted at women or at the feminized other, whoever that is. In terms of whether porn can be positive and whether there's a role for positive porn, I think that it's a common question. I think people want there to be better porn, and I think better porn does exist, but it's not generally what you find on those free online sites, which is what children and young people are exposed to. It's pretty marginal in the scheme of porn, and even content that might claim to be better, so content that might be made with feminist principles or, refer to itself as feminist porn or ethical porn, it's not always clear that that porn is better either. It might be better in terms of how it pays its performers and how it negotiates consent with the performers. It might be better in terms of its sexual health practices and protections for those performers, but it doesn't necessarily show less aggression, for example. It doesn't necessarily not depict racism. So we can tend to see some of the same kinds of tropes across those different genres, but less of it in some of them, if you like. Actually, some research that's compared feminist queer porn with heterosexual mainstream porn found higher levels of aggression in the feminist queer porn, and we know that there are significant levels in heterosexual mainstream porn. So it's not that better porn doesn't exist, but you're probably going to need to pay for it. We know that children and young people generally aren't. And even if you do pay for it, it can be difficult to find. When you go onto those aggregator sites, you end up in this big mix of content. And if you find better content on there, then it's likely the next video that pops up is going to be degrading and, aggressive and at least be reinforcing gender inequality, gender stereotypes. So is there a role for someone to be creating that content to shape better expectations? Maybe, if people want to, and some people have had a go at that. But part of what we hear in our interviews with the industry as well is there's not much of a business model in it. It's not actually what gets and maintains viewer attention in the way that the online economy works.
So, in this sort of porn landscape and the porn world, there are multiple stakeholders here. Not only the people who create porn, the industry actors, consumers, social media, parents of children, etc. With all of these different parties involved, the onus does fall in some parts on all of these people in different amounts. What can we do to, almost regulate this more in a official and unofficial way?
Yeah, I think there are four broad things that we can do to support young people and children around this issue. The first is that I think we can and we should try to prevent and limit their exposure and access to pornography. And that needs to happen at those formal structural regulatory levels, as well as more directly in our roles with children and young people. So at a structural level, it means things like age assurance, some way of trying at least to ensure that children and young people are not exposed to content that in an offline context they wouldn't be allowed to be exposed to, that wouldn't be legally permitted. For some reason, the online economy has just evaded responsibility for these kinds of checks and balances. And I think we're seeing a significant move, including in the UK and in Australia, towards a recognition of the need for some kind of regulation and the implementation of age verification. Countries around the world are working towards how to do that in a way that protects privacy and security and respects the rights of children and young people to be part of the online world, but also their rights to be free from violent, degrading sexual content that's not made for them or that's not suitable for them to be exposed to. And that is not just about porn sites. That is about the whole online ecosystem that enables children and young people to access it, which is social media companies, search engines, ISPs, like all the different components of the online industry that all the industries that help to make porn accessible to children and young people have some responsibility in here. But it's pretty clear that many of those players are not going to take that action unless they're held accountable by governments. So governments have responsibility for setting up the regulatory regimes to manage that. Then more directly with young people, limiting and preventing their use means things like filters on modems and devices, time-limited access, not having them in bedrooms and bathrooms, having them in shared spaces in the home. That's clearly, there's roles there for parents and for schools and others around managing that. But often the industry and some other porn advocates really want to put all of that responsibility on parents. And I think that's entirely unreasonable to leave parents responsible for managing the influence of a multi-billion-dollar global industry that's beaming their content into the devices on our children's, in our children's pockets. It's very unfair. So we need all of those different layers to be playing that role. Limiting and preventing, we know that there's no silver bullet to this. There's no single solution for preventing children's exposure to pornography at this time. And sometimes there's an argument that we shouldn't pursue age verification because adolescents who want to get access to porn are still going to be able to. And you're right that they're right that that's likely, but that we can limit a lot of unintentional exposure, which often occurs with younger children where the risks are higher as well. And we can also prevent a lot of extended exposure. And the difference between seeing one porn video or 10 porn videos and 1,000 hours of porn is huge. So although we can't prevent exposure altogether, strategies that seek to prevent and limit are still really worth implementing, but we need to do more than that. So the second thing we can do is to try to equip young people and children to develop the skills that they need to navigate pornography's influence more safely. So things like developing their critical thinking skills, supporting them in online safety, knowledge and behaviour, respectful relating, helping them think critically about gender stereotypes, media literacy, help-seeking knowledge and behaviour. We can develop these skills in them from when they're very young without even mentioning pornography, just supporting them around broader media, around general respectful relating, general online safety. Then as they get older, we can support them to, for example, think critically about more sexualized media like music videos or advertising. And then as they get older again, we have overt conversations with them about pornography and its influence. We don't need to show children and young people pornography in order to support them to critique it. It's not legal to do that generally, and there are a lot of good reasons for that. There are creative ways that we can have those conversations. We also need to be realistic about the limitations of this approach, because being able to critique something isn't the same thing as being free from its influence. If it was, then ads wouldn't work. But they are really important skills, and the longer we can put off children being exposed to porn and the more we can support them to develop these skills before they see it, the greater we can help mitigate the risks of porn's influence when they do see it. The third thing we can do is help them to build skills. So they might be really good at critical thinking, and they might even choose not to watch porn because they think it's not going to be a good way to learn about sex, which they'd be right about. But how do they respond to peer group pressure to watch it, or pressure from an intimate partner to mimic it, or pressure from someone they know or they don't know online to create sexual imagery of themselves? And these are the same kinds of skills we want them to develop around other health and wellbeing issues. And then finally, and I think importantly, we need to help young people aspire to a better model of relationships and sexuality. So we don't want to just say that's not a good way of engaging in, being intimate with another human being. We need to also help them catch a vision, inspire them around respect, consent, mutuality, how great sex can be when everybody involved really likes what's happening. They feel good about it at the time and good about it afterwards. It's not about trying to get someone to do something that isn't feeling good for them. That's a terrible model of sexuality.
I mean, when I think back to my sex ed lessons in school when I was, between the ages of 11 and 13, all I can remember was, a teacher getting out a cucumber and teaching everyone how to put a condom on a cucumber. And we probably had 2 or 3 sex ed lessons, and they almost seemed shoehorned into our curriculum, in between chemistry and maths. Okay, here you go. Here's a token sex ed lesson. There was no talk about, the anatomy of genitalia, safe sex practices. There was just 1 or 2 things which are just put out there. And I don't think that's robust enough for, a 13-year-old who may be about to embark on their first sexual experiences, to even know about, know well enough about these things. So is there a role for sex ed to compete with pornography as an educator for youngsters and make sex ed, more inclusive, more exciting, so people don't reach for porn as a portal to learn more about sex and their own bodies?
Or when they do reach for it, that they have a counter reference point that's more reliable and accurate. I think that the prevalence and the nature of pornography compel us to do better comprehensive relationships and sexuality education. If we don't, we are leaving young people's sexuality education up to the porn industry, and that's not going to end well for anyone. So I think, young people are clear in their desire for relationships and sexuality education that is grounded in their lived realities. They don't need sexuality education that is limited and airy-fairy and not, addressing what they're really experiencing. And porn is now, as you said, the default sexuality educator for many young people. To not address pornography and its influence is to fail to equip young people for sexuality in the 21st century, because that's the reality of, even if they're not consumers of porn themselves, it's very likely that their partners are or will have been. So it still can be shaping their sexual experiences. So we need what we might call porn literacy, or I prefer to refer to it as education to address pornography's influence, embedded into relationships and sexuality education. But as I said, that starts with critical media literacy and online safety and builds into more overt conversations about porn. I also think we need to move beyond the sort of biological and risk harm based discussion of sexuality and into sexuality education that also incorporates content about pleasure, about consent, about relationships, so that we're giving young, actually, those are the reasons that many people have sex, right? They have sex because it feels good, because they want to engage with another human being in that way, because of something they get from the relationship. So if our sexuality education is just about how to not catch an STI or how to not get pregnant when you don't plan to, we're missing the point of why most people actually, engage in sex with someone. So we need to address the harmful influences and the kind of misrepresentations in porn and in other influences. And we need to talk about the positive elements as well, so that they're getting clear messages about what respectful, consenting, mutually pleasurable sex might be like for people, and why that's worth aspiring to.
One thing we've not really touched upon on this conversation is the effect of porn on body image. And obviously there's a lot of young people, just similar to social media, where they see a gym influencer with a six-pack, with a perfect body, and they aspire to be like them. But then we have to be cognizant of the fact that social media is a highlight reel that's showing maybe the 1% of the ideal body image, or what society feels is the ideal body image. And it's similar in porn, where a lot of the actors are selected for exaggerated characteristics, large penises, bigger breasts potentially, whatever it is. It caters to all different audiences. And I guess particularly, in both men and women, for men looking at penis size, for example, that's historically and traditionally been a huge point of affecting a man's mental health, thinking that they're less of a man or maybe less than because of preconceived notions about their own penis size, if it's less than average, and then seeing porn and that being almost emphasized even more. Or women looking at another woman on porn with large breasts and lip fillers and some ideal body shape that society thinks is the ideal. How much of an impact does that have on a mental health point of view of people watching porn? And aside from all the other things we mentioned, just comparing themselves to these kind of fit athletic people with disproportioned body parts.
Yeah, and young people do talk about comparing themselves with what they've seen in pornography. Young men often talk about penis size and, feeling that they don't live up to the expectations that porn might create for them. And young women talk about perfectly molded vulva and, exquisite breasts, and comparing their bodies with what they've seen in pornography. For many young people, pornography might be the only place where they see, other other bodies, in that, certainly with that level of explicitness. Even if they're getting undressed in the change room at school for sports, they're probably not looking right up close at their, at their friends' penises, etc. For trans young people, porn very much might be the only place that they see other representations of or depictions of trans bodies. And if they're looking at trans bodies in porn, they're also likely to see very limited constructions of what a trans body looks like. For example, they're unlikely to see trans masculine bodies in pornography unless they're watching very niche pornography. They're likely to see trans women in porn, but they're likely to be trans women who have a particular body type, which is to say that they've had breast augmentation, but they haven't had lower surgery. And young people and adults, talk about the way that porn's representations of bodies and of trans bodies can create expectations and demands from sexual partners who think that is what a trans person must look like. So I think for young people in general, that can impact on their sense of self and their body esteem. For trans young people, the impact can be even greater, and very kind of limiting, and combined with the sorts of transphobic and violence and aggressive behaviours that are often directed at trans women in porn can very much impact on their sense of self. We are seeing an increase in interventions such as breast augmentation and labiaplasty, with many people, including plastic surgeons, pointing to the role that pornography appears to be playing in those increases. And I think with labiaplasty, for example, that one of the factors is the normalisation of the removal of pubic hair, which is common in pornography. It's not always, but it's very, very common in pornography. And then, of course, when you remove the pubic hair, you see the vulva and, the labia much more clearly. And in pornography, you don't tend to see the incredible diversity that women have in their labia, and also having removal of pubic hair, which has become a common practice outside of porn as well, means that you're more likely to get abrasions of your inner labia that, might mean that you're more likely to identify as needing to, wanting to have surgery to address something that might not be an issue if you had the cushioning of pubic hair. So we end up seeing this kind of cyclical relationship between porn's influence on aesthetic norms, with the removal of pubic hair, and then kind of not representing that diversity of labia.
To that end, a lot of people do artificially edit, Photoshop, and curate their images to live up to something they may not need to. And also, a sort of a further extreme from this has been the rise of AI technology and how that's allowed people to even, to a greater degree, manipulate things and images online and videos, and particularly with the rise of AI and deepfakes. We've seen recently, within the last year, a deepfake pornographic image of Taylor Swift, which, really went viral. And I guess it's worrying and emblematic of a huge problem on the horizon where, if you can do deepfakes of people with and without clothes, and you have deepfake pornography, where do we stop? I mean, deepfake pornographic images of celebrities, of famous people, of friends, family. It's quite worrying.
It is really concerning. I think that deepfake technology and the significant increase in accessibility of that technology. So it used to be that not that long ago you needed to have quite good, quite sophisticated technical skills and a lot of data of the person that you're wanting to create that fake imagery of in order to create that imagery. It might take you a long time. You need to be very skilled and you need to have a lot of data. That's all shifted so that now, just in very recent times, you only need a very small amount of content, even just, a photograph, and you can not have very sophisticated technical skills. You can just use an app that makes it very easy and rapid. So we are seeing a significant increase in what we would call image-based abuse. So the, artificial creation of sexual imagery that might be someone not engaged, that never engaged in that behaviour. It might be the face of someone that's put on to someone else. It might be them being shown to say or do something different from what they said. But it's fake content, and the consequences for the victim survivors of these crimes can be enormous, can be really huge. The consequences for them, emotionally, socially, for their work context, their level of their sense of safety, their ability to engage online and offline. So I think we very rapidly need to see an increase in legislation that addresses the harms, and not just addresses the people who create that imagery, but also the platforms that enable it.
I mean, so far, the conversation we've had has centered around the impact of porn on other people. But more recently, we've had ex and former porn stars, for example, Mia Khalifa, has come out on social media and discussed her own treatment in the industry itself. So even from the people within the porn industry, it seems to be, not a great area to work in and live in.
Yeah, I think that there are people within the industry who very much want to say that there are, consenting, happy, willing performers who are doing the work that they love to do and they want to be there. And that may well be a subsection of the industry. But there's also a lot of experiences of coercion and sexual violence in the industry, and in any industry where you have significant power inequalities. There's the gig economy is big in the porn industry, so there's a lack of job security for people, which means they're more vulnerable to needing to do things that they don't want to do. Yeah, I think that there are significant harms that occur in that industry, and then also that occur because of the stigmatization of people working in that industry. So it can be difficult for them to move into other work or other fields because they get labelled and stigmatized by their work in pornography, which makes it a cycle of continuing to work in a space that, whether or not they're enjoying that work. So yeah, I think there are significant challenges around how, even in the most well-meaning context within that industry, there are real challenges around how to negotiate consent, how to avoid sexual coercion and harm, how to manage the power imbalances between producers and directors and performers, and also between the online platforms that sometimes often are, enabling the theft of the intellectual property of the producers, that has a flow down effect on the whole industry.
How does someone tell if they're addicted to porn, and what can they do about it if they are?
One of the key signs around kind of compulsive use of porn is if someone doesn't feel able to stop. If they think, I think I'm using this too often, I feel like I'm a bit out of control, and then they try to stop using it, and they find that really difficult to do. If it's getting in the way of things that they want to be doing or things that they ought to be doing, like work or study or relationships or sleep, those are all indicators. Then the thing to do would be to seek some therapeutic support from someone who has expertise in supporting around compulsive porn use or other compulsive behaviours. I think one of the challenges is around not creating and perpetuating shame for people. So, if people raise that they're concerned about their levels of porn use, they might not raise it because they're feeling ashamed of their porn use. And I think part of what we need to do as a society is to help people be freer to say what they're struggling with, including about pornography, and to help people understand that it's not just a question of kind of individual strength or strength of character. Actually, these are very sophisticated industries that use sophisticated technologies to try to capture attention in an ongoing way. So it's true with social media as well, that many people are finding themselves spending much more time on social media than they might say that they think they want to, that they think is good for them, that reflects the level of value that they think social media has in their life, because they're designed to capture and maintain our attention. So if we can somehow help people to feel less shameful or guilty or bad about themselves, and support them to think critically about what they're engaging in, and with the tools to move out of porn having that sort of grasp on their life, I think that's much more constructive.
Yeah, I think this is a really valuable conversation to have, just because, as you mentioned earlier, people often consume porn on their own and it's done in secrecy. It's a taboo thing. So actually, when problems do arise, or, these kind of greater societal problems do exist, people don't know about them because we don't, typically go down the pub or for a lunch with friends, and people don't discuss those sort of intimate, taboo aspects of their lives. So, Maree, thank you so much for coming on and being so open and, very academic about porn, which is good to hear.
Pleasure.
Thanks again to Maree Crabbe. When did you first discover porn, and what's your relationship with it today? Let me know in the comments below. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the weekly Dr. Karan Explores podcast. I'll see you scoundrels next week.